The courthouse in Silver Creek had never held so many souls at once. Bodies pressed against bodies in the stifling July heat, the air thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and something darker, the metallic tang of barely contained rage. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the territorial town's main street, but inside the cramped wooden building, tension ran colder than winter wind through the mountains. Naalnish sat motionless in the back corner, his wrists bound with iron shackles that had already worn raw patches on his dark skin. The Apache warrior's black hair hung loose around his shoulders, framing a face carved from desert stone. His eyes, dark as midnight water, surveyed the packed room with the same careful attention he'd once used to read mountain trails for enemy sign. Every breath, every whispered word, every shift in the crowd's mood, he catalogued it all. 3 rows ahead, Sarah Fletcher clutched a worn handkerchief, her knuckles white against the faded black fabric of her mourning dress. The widow's auburn hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the grief-etched lines around her green eyes. She hadn't looked back at the prisoner, not once since taking her seat among the other bereaved families, but Naalnish could feel her sorrow like heat radiating from a campfire. "All rise for the Honourable Judge Samuel Morrison," called the bailiff, a nervous man whose voice cracked on the words. The crowd shuffled to their feet with a sound like wind through dry leaves. Judge Morrison entered through a side door, his black robes billowing around his tall, gaunt frame. Silver hair crowned a face weathered by 20 years of frontier justice, and his pale blue eyes held the weariness of a man who'd seen too much blood spilled over too little understanding. "Be seated," Morrison commanded, settling behind his oak desk with deliberate care. The gavel in his hand seemed to weigh heavy as he surveyed the packed courthouse. "We are here today to determine the fate of the Apache warrior known as Naalnish, captured following the raid on the Fletcher homestead and surrounding properties on June 15th of this year." A murmur rippled through the crowd, like distant thunder. Sarah Fletcher's shoulders trembled, and beside her Mary Goodwin reached over to squeeze her hand. Mary's own husband had fallen in the same raid, cut down while trying to protect their livestock. Her round face, once quick to smile, now held the hollow look of someone who'd forgotten how joy felt. "The defendant stands accused of murder, destruction of property, and acts of warfare against the citizens of this territory," Judge Morrison continued, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. "Captain Thornton, please state the circumstances of the capture." Captain James Thornton rose from his seat near the front, his blue cavalry uniform crisp despite the heat. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually clean-shaven jaw bore several days' worth of stubble. At 35, he'd spent more years chasing Apache war parties across the desert than he cared to count, and each campaign had carved deeper lines into his weathered face. "Your Honor, my patrol tracked the war party responsible for the Fletcher homestead attack for 6 days across the Dragoon Mountains. We engaged them in battle near Skeleton Canyon. During the fighting, most of the warriors escaped, but we managed to capture this one." Thornton gestured toward Naalnish without looking directly at him. "He was wounded but refused medical treatment. He also refused to speak, Your Honor. Hasn't said a word since we took him." Naalnish's expression never changed, but something flickered behind his dark eyes. Not fear, but a kind of patient endurance, like a mountain waiting for the storm to pass. He understood more English than these white men suspected, had learned it during his years of fighting them, but silence was its own kind of weapon. "Mr. Prosecutor," Judge Morrison said, nodding to a thin man with a waxed mustache, "present your case." District Attorney William Hayes stood, straightening his brown vest with nervous fingers. His wife Elizabeth sat in the second row, her own widow's weeds as fresh as her grief. Hayes had volunteered to prosecute this case personally after losing his own brother-in-law in the raid. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear," Hayes began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "This savage participated in an unprovoked attack that left 4 good men dead and several homesteads burned to the ground. Thomas Fletcher, Robert Goodwin, and Michael O'Brien were murdered in cold blood while defending their families and property. The defendant may refuse to speak, but the blood on his hands speaks loud enough." Elizabeth Hayes dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while around the courtroom, angry mutters rose like steam from a kettle. Someone in the back shouted, "Hang the heathen!" and others took up the cry until Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom, or I will clear it entirely." Morrison's pale eyes swept the crowd like a scythe through wheat. "Continue, Mr. Hayes." But as the prosecutor droned on about evidence and testimony, Sarah Fletcher found herself studying the prisoner despite her intentions. There was something in his stillness that reminded her not of the savage beast she'd expected, but of her own Thomas in his final moments, that same quiet dignity in the face of inevitable fate. The thought disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising relief from the heat, but threatening something else entirely. In the courthouse, two worlds prepared for collision, and the weight of silence pressed down on them all like the desert sky before lightning strikes. The trial had only just begun, but already the lines were drawn in sand that the wind was preparing to shift. The second day of testimony brought Father Miguel Santos to the witness stand, his brown Franciscan robes a stark contrast to the hostile faces surrounding him. The elderly priest had ministered to both Apache and settler communities for over 2 decades, earning respect from both sides through his dedication to healing rather than judgment. His weathered hands shook slightly as he placed them on the Bible to swear his oath. "Father Santos," District Attorney Hayes began, his voice sharp as broken glass, "you've had extensive contact with Apache tribes in this region. In your experience, are these people capable of reason, of understanding right from wrong as civilized men do?" The priest's dark eyes found Naalnish in the back corner, and for a moment, something passed between them, a recognition born of shared hardship in the unforgiving desert. "Mr. Hayes, I have found the Apache to be a people of deep honor and complex traditions. They understand justice, though their definition may differ from ours." A ripple of discontent swept through the courtroom. Sarah Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands twisting the fabric of her black dress. She remembered Father Santos from Thomas's funeral, how his gentle words had been the only comfort in those dark hours. But now his testimony seemed to challenge everything she thought she knew about her husband's killers. "But surely, Father," Hayes pressed, his mustache twitching with irritation, "you cannot defend the brutal murder of innocent settlers?" "I defend no man's violence regardless of his race," Father Santos replied firmly. "But I have also seen Apache mothers weep over their slain children, Apache fathers bury their sons killed by our soldiers. Grief knows no color, Mr. Hayes. Neither does the desire for justice." Captain Thornton leaned forward in his seat, his jaw clenched tight. He'd ridden with Father Santos on several occasions, had seen the priest tend to wounded Apache with the same care he showed injured cavalry troopers. The memory made his own role in this endless cycle of violence feel heavier than his cavalry saber. Judge Morrison studied the priest with thoughtful eyes. "Father Santos, did you know any of the men killed in the Fletcher homestead raid?" "I did, Your Honor. Thomas Fletcher was a good man, devout in his faith. He often helped me distribute supplies to the reservation Apache during the harsh winter months. Robert Goodwin, too. He once shared his harvest with Apache families when their government rations failed to arrive." The courtroom fell silent at this revelation. Sarah Fletcher's breath caught in her throat. She'd known her husband was generous, but he'd never spoken of helping Apache families. The image of Thomas, her Thomas, showing kindness to the very people who would later kill him, created a painful confusion in her chest. Mary Goodwin, seated beside Sarah, began to weep quietly. "Robert never told me," she whispered. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" Elizabeth Hayes, her own face pale with shock, turned to stare at her husband. The prosecutor's confident demeanor had cracked, revealing the uncertainty beneath. This wasn't the simple tale of savage violence he'd prepared to tell. "Your Honor," Hayes said, struggling to regain control, "whatever charitable acts these men may have performed doesn't change the fact that they were murdered by Apache warriors. The defendant has a name," interrupted a new voice from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned as Dr. Catherine Wells rose from her seat near the wall. The territory's only female physician had arrived that morning on the stage from Tucson, her medical bag clutched in one hand and a worn leather journal in the other. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to looking death in the face. "Dr. Wells," Judge Morrison said with obvious respect, "you weren't called as a witness. I'm calling myself, Your Honor, if the court will permit. I treated the wounded from both sides after the Skeleton Canyon engagement. I believe I have information relevant to this case." Hayes started to object, but Morrison raised his hand. "I'll allow it. Dr. Wells, please approach the bench." As the doctor walked to the front of the courtroom, her boots clicking on the wooden floor, Naalnish watched her with sharp attention. Something in her bearing, her direct manner, reminded him of the Apache medicine women he'd known, healers who saw beyond the surface of things to the truth beneath. "Dr. Wells," Judge Morrison said, "what information do you wish to share with this court?" The doctor opened her leather journal. its pages filled with neat handwriting. Your Honor, when I examined the Apache prisoner after his capture, I found evidence of old wounds, scars from bullets and blade cuts that had healed years ago. But I also found something else. She looked directly at Naalnish, her expression softening. He bears the mark of a cavalry saber across his ribs, a wound that would have been fatal if not for skilled medical treatment, Anglo-medical treatment. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Captain Thornton's face had gone white as desert bone. Furthermore, Doctor, Wells continued, raising her voice above the noise, this man's hands show evidence of farming, soil embedded under his nails, calluses consistent with handling farming tools rather than just weapons. This is not simply a warrior, Your Honor. This is a man who has tried to build as well as fight. Sarah Fletcher found herself staring at Naalnish with new eyes. The Apache warrior sat as still as carved stone, but she could see something in his dark gaze that she'd missed before, not just the hardness of a fighter, but the weariness of someone who had lost too much. Outside, the storm clouds had grown darker, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the courthouse windows like fingers demanding entry. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant lightning and the promise of a desert transformed. As Dr. Wells returned to her seat, Judge Morrison looked out at the packed courtroom, then at the silent Apache warrior in the corner. This court will recess until tomorrow morning, he announced. I suggest everyone use this time to consider what they've heard today. But as the crowd began to file out into the approaching storm, Sarah Fletcher remained in her seat, her green eyes fixed on the man who had become something more complex than the simple enemy she'd expected to face. The rain began in earnest as the courthouse emptied, and through it all Naalnish sat in his chains, patient as the desert itself, waiting for whatever truth the storm might bring. The third day dawned grey and humid, the storm having passed but leaving the air thick with moisture and unspoken tensions. The courthouse filled again, though fewer townspeople attended. Some had grown uncomfortable with the complexities emerging from what should have been a simple case of frontier justice. Captain Thornton took the witness stand with reluctance, etched in every line of his face. His uniform was freshly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but his eyes held the haunted look of a man forced to confront uncomfortable truths about his own actions. Captain, Judge Morrison began, his voice gentler than usual, Dr. Wells mentioned yesterday that the defendant bears scars from a cavalry saber. Do you have any knowledge of such an encounter? Thornton's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. Yes, Your Honor, it was 3 years ago, during the uprising at San Carlos. We'd been ordered to bring in a group of Apache who'd left the reservation without permission. They were trying to reach their traditional burial grounds in the Chiricahua Mountains. Sarah Fletcher leaned forward in her seat, drawn despite herself to this glimpse into the prisoner's past. Beside her, Mary Goodwin had stopped her quiet weeping, her round face intent on the captain's words. Continue, Captain, Morrison prompted. There was a fight. Several Apache were killed and we wounded others. This one, Thornton gestured toward Naalnish without meeting his eyes. He could have escaped with the others. Instead, he stayed behind to cover their retreat. My saber caught him across the ribs as he made his stand. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's pen and the distant sound of water dripping from the eaves outside. Why didn't you finish him, Captain? District Attorney Hayes interjected, his voice sharp with accusation. Military protocol would have... Because he wasn't trying to kill me, Thornton interrupted, his voice raw. He was just trying to protect his people. When I had him down, wounded and helpless, he looked at me with such dignity, such acceptance. I couldn't do it. I had my men carry him to the post-surgeon instead. Elizabeth Hayes stared at her husband, the prosecutor, with something approaching horror. The simple narrative of savage violence was crumbling before her eyes, revealing a web of choices and consequences that made her head spin. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. And after his recovery, he was released back to the reservation. The incident was overlooked in my official report. Thornton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I thought it was mercy. Now I wonder if I just prolonged everyone's suffering. The judge turned his attention to the back corner, where Naalnish sat in his chains. Does the defendant wish to respond to Captain Thornton's testimony? For the first time since the trial began, Naalnish stirred. His dark eyes met Thornton's across the crowded room, and something passed between them, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of shared burden. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear, carrying the weight of desert wind through ancient canyons. I remember the blue coat who did not kill when killing was expected, Naalnish said in heavily accented but precise English. Your mercy was not wasted, Captain. It allowed me to see my daughter marry, to help my people through another hard winter. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Sarah Fletcher felt her breath catch. This was the first time she'd heard the prisoner speak, and his words revealed a man with family, with love and loss just as real as her own. Your Honor, Hayes objected, struggling to regain control of his case. The defendant's personal circumstances don't excuse— Mr. Hayes, Morrison interrupted, his pale eyes flashing. I think this court needs to hear what the defendant has to say. Continue, Naalnish. The Apache warrior shifted in his seat, the chains around his wrists clinking softly. When he spoke again, his words carried the rhythm of oral tradition, the cadence of stories told around fires beneath endless stars. The White Father in Washington promised my people we could live on our ancestral lands if we made peace. We signed papers, gave up our weapons, agreed to learn your farming ways, but the paper promises blew away like dust in the wind. His eyes found Sarah Fletcher's across the room, holding her gaze with unexpected gentleness. When government agents stopped bringing food to the reservation, when our children began to starve, some of us remembered the old ways. We left San Carlos to hunt in the mountains our grandfathers knew. Father Santos leaned forward in his seat, his weathered face creased with sorrow. He'd seen the conditions on the reservation, had pleaded with territorial officials for better treatment of the Apache people there. The raid on the Fletcher homestead, Naalnish continued, his voice growing heavier, was not meant to kill. We came for cattle, for food to feed our families. But the white men fought to protect what they saw as theirs, and we fought to protect our ability to feed our children. Death came because both sides chose to stand rather than bend. Mary Goodwin began to sob quietly, her hands pressed to her mouth. The simple story of her husband's heroic death was being replaced by something far more complex and painful, a tragedy where good men on both sides had died for reasons that seemed increasingly senseless. Thomas Fletcher, Naalnish said suddenly, and Sarah's head snapped up. The man with kind eyes who brought blankets to the reservation. He knew me. In the fighting, when our eyes met across the chaos, I saw recognition in his face, and sorrow. Sarah Fletcher felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You're lying, she whispered, her voice breaking. Naalnish's dark eyes never left hers. Your husband died trying to call for peace, not war. His last words were not of hatred, but of grief for what we had all become. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Sarah Fletcher began to scream, not in rage, but in a grief so raw and deep it seemed to tear the very air. Mary Goodwin reached for her, and together the two widows clung to each other as the full weight of their losses crashed over them like a flash flood in a desert arroyo. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another storm. But inside the courthouse, a different kind of tempest was building, one that would challenge everything the people of Silver Creek thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the true cost of survival in an unforgiving land. The fourth day of the trial brought an unexpected witness, Agent Benjamin Crawford from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, summoned from the territorial capital by Judge Morrison himself. Crawford was a thin, nervous man, whose pale complexion and soft hands marked him as someone more familiar with ledger books than desert hardships. His appearance in the courthouse created a stir among the remaining spectators, many of whom had never seen a federal official in their remote town. Agent Crawford, Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made the bureaucrat shift uncomfortably in the witness chair. Please explain to this court the current state of provisions at the San Carlos reservation. Crawford tugged at his collar, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Your Honor, the reservation receives regular shipments of government supplies according to treaty obligations. I didn't ask about what should happen, Agent Crawford. I asked about what is happening. Morrison's pale eyes could have cut glass. Dr. Wells has provided this court with medical evidence of malnutrition among Apache families. Father Santos has testified about failed supply deliveries. What is your explanation? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Sarah Fletcher found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't say why. Beside her, Mary Goodwin gripped her handkerchief so tightly her knuckles had gone white. There have been irregularities in the supply chain, Crawford admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Some shipments have been delayed due to budget constraints. Others have been redirected to areas deemed of higher priority. Redirected where? Morrison demanded. Crawford's face flushed red. To military posts, Your Honor. The cavalry requires provisions for their operations, and sometimes the Apache supplies are requisitioned to meet those needs. Captain Thornton shot to his feet, his face dark with fury. Your Honor, I must object. My men have gone without rations rather than take food meant for reservation families. This is not standard military practice. Sit down, Captain, Morrison said quietly, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Agent Crawford, are you telling this court that the United States government has systematically broken its treaty obligations by stealing food meant for Apache families and giving it to the very soldiers ordered to keep those families confined? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant wildfire. Crawford's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his career flashing before his eyes with each passing second. In the back corner, Naalnish watched the proceedings with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout the trial, but something had changed in his dark eyes. Where before there had been resignation, now there was a flicker of something else. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the recognition that truth, however painful, was finally being spoken in this place. Furthermore, Morrison continued, his voice growing harder with each word, I have here a telegram from the Territorial Governor's Office indicating that Apache rations have been reduced by 60% over the past year, ostensibly due to decreased population. Agent Crawford, how does one account for decreased population on a reservation where families are closely monitored? Elizabeth Hayes leaned forward in her seat, her face pale. As the wife of the prosecutor, she'd expected to witness a simple execution of justice. Instead, she was seeing the ugly machinery of government policy laid bare, revealing complicity that reached far beyond any individual act of violence. Disease, Your Honor, Crawford mumbled, and some families have left the reservation without permission, to starve in freedom rather than die in captivity, Naalnish said quietly from his corner. The words cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. Judge Morrison turned to the Apache warrior, his expression unreadable. Naalnish, the judge said carefully, do you wish to make a formal statement to this court? The Apache warrior rose slowly, his chains clinking in the sudden silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains and the patience of desert stone. I have listened to 3 days of testimony about my crimes, my people's savagery, our inability to understand civilization. But no one has spoken of the children who died at San Carlos because the promised food never came. No one has mentioned the old ones who froze because the blankets meant for winter distribution were sold to traders in Tucson. Sarah Fletcher felt tears burning behind her eyes. The image of starving children, of elderly people dying from cold, created a pain in her chest that had nothing to do with her own grief. When my people left the reservation, Naalnish continued, we did not seek war. We sought only what any father seeks, the ability to feed his family. The mountains have always provided for the Apache. We know every stream, every hidden valley where game runs. But your soldiers followed us even there, drove us from places where no white man would ever want to live. Father Santos nodded slowly from his seat, his dark eyes reflecting the weight of witnessing so much suffering on both sides of this conflict. The raid on the Fletcher homestead was born of desperation, not hatred, Naalnish said, his gaze finding Sarah across the crowded room. When we came for the cattle, your husband recognized me from the reservation. He called my name, spoke words in my language that he had learned from the priest. He asked why we had come. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing seemed unnaturally loud. I told him we came because our children were dying. He lowered his rifle then, stepped forward with his hands open, but other men were not so understanding. They saw only Apache warriors and chose to fight. In the confusion that followed, good men died on both sides, men who might have found peace if fear and anger had not poisoned the air between us. Mary Goodwin was weeping openly now, her soft sobs the only sound in the packed courthouse. Beside her, Sarah Fletcher sat motionless as carved stone, her green eyes locked on the Apache warrior who had just revealed the full tragedy of her husband's death. Your Honor, District Attorney Hayes said weakly, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his case. Regardless of the circumstances, the law is clear. The defendant participated in actions that resulted in the deaths of 4 citizens. The law, Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice heavy with exhaustion, is supposed to serve justice, Mr. Hayes. But what justice can there be when the very government that demands punishment for breaking treaties has itself broken every promise it ever made to these people? Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the courthouse windows. The sound seemed to echo the tears being shed inside, where the simple certainties of frontier justice were drowning in the murky waters of complicated truth. As the day's testimony concluded, and the court prepared to recess, Sarah Fletcher remained in her seat, staring at the Apache warrior who had become something she never expected to face. Not a monster, but a father who had watched his children starve while others grew fat on broken promises. The storm was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would challenge everything the people of Silver Creek thought they knew about guilt, innocence, and the true meaning of justice in a land where survival often came at the cost of honor. The final day of the trial dawned clear and still, the desert air washed clean by the previous night's storm. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the wooden sidewalk outside. Word had spread throughout the territory about the revelations that had emerged, drawing spectators from as far away as Tucson and Tombstone. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with the measured pace of a man carrying the weight of an impossible decision. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his black robes pressed and formal, but his pale blue eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had spent the night wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "Before I render my verdict," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the nervous murmur of the crowd, "I will hear final statements from both counsels and from the defendant if he chooses to speak." District Attorney Hayes rose first, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow look of a man whose certainties had been systematically dismantled. His brown suit hung loose on his frame, as if the events of the past week had physically diminished him. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his voice barely steady, "the law requires that we find the defendant guilty of the charges against him. Regardless of the circumstances that led to the violence, 4 men are dead. The families of those men deserve justice." But even as he spoke the words, Hayes seemed to realize their inadequacy. His wife Elizabeth sat in the front row, her face turned away from him, unable to meet his eyes. The simple narrative of justice he had tried to construct lay in ruins around him. When Hayes sat down, the appointed defense counsel, a young lawyer named Peterson who had barely spoken throughout the trial, rose nervously. "Your Honor, I would ask this court to consider the broader context of these events. My client acted not from malice, but from the desperate need to feed his starving people. If there is guilt here, it extends far beyond one Apache warrior." Judge Morrison nodded gravely, then turned his attention to the back corner where Naalnish sat in his chains. "Does the defendant wish to make a final statement?" Naalnish rose slowly, his movements deliberate despite the weight of his shackles. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet dignity that had marked him throughout the trial. "I have no words that can bring back the dead, no prayers that can heal the wounds my actions helped create. Thomas Fletcher was a good man who died trying to prevent the very violence that claimed him. Robert Goodwin shared his harvest with my people when the government would not. These men deserved better than the death that found them." Sarah Fletcher felt fresh tears burning her eyes as she listened to the Apache warrior honor her husband's memory with more grace than she had been able to manage in her own grief. "But I also think of my daughter, who has not seen her father for 2 moons. I think of the Apache children who still wait for food that will never come, and the mothers who must choose between watching their families starve on the reservation or watching them die as fugitives in the mountains." Naalnish's dark eyes swept the packed courtroom, finding and holding the gaze of each widow in turn. "If my death will bring peace, I accept it. But if my death is only revenge, it will solve nothing. The hunger will remain. The broken promises will remain. And more good men will die on both sides, until someone finds the courage to speak truth instead of comfortable lies." The courtroom fell silent as Naalnish sat down, his statement hanging in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. Judge Morrison stared at his folded hands for a long moment, then looked up at the packed courthouse with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of a week. "In my 20 years on this bench," Morrison began, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say, "I have never presided over a case that so clearly illustrates the difference between law and justice. The law says that Naalnish is guilty of murder. The evidence supports this conclusion, but justice demands that we acknowledge the larger crimes that created this tragedy." A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. In the front rows, the widows sat frozen, waiting for words that would either vindicate their suffering or challenge everything they thought they understood about their losses. "Therefore," Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger, "I find the defendant guilty of manslaughter in the deaths of Thomas Fletcher, Robert Goodwin, Michael O'Brien, and James Murphy. However, given the extraordinary circumstances revealed in this trial, the systematic violation of federal treaties, the deliberate starvation of Apache families, and the defendant's own attempts to prevent violence, I sentence him to time served and immediate release. The courthouse erupted in chaos. Angry shouts mixed with gasps of surprise, and several men in the back began pushing toward the front, their faces dark with rage. But before the situation could spiral into violence, something unexpected happened. Sarah Fletcher stood up. The widow's action was so sudden, so unexpected, that it cut through the noise like a church bell. All eyes turned to her as she stepped into the aisle, her black dress stark against the rough wooden floor. "Wait," she called out, her voice carrying despite its tremor. "Please, all of you, wait." The courthouse gradually fell silent, drawn by the quiet authority in her voice. Sarah Fletcher had lost more than anyone in this room. Her husband, her future, her simple understanding of right and wrong. If anyone had the right to demand blood for blood, it was her. "I came here wanting to see this man hang," Sarah said, her green eyes finding Naalnish across the crowded room. "I wanted someone to pay for Thomas's death, for the hole torn in my life that will never heal. But I've learned something these past days that I wish I could forget." Mary Goodwin rose from her seat, her round face streaked with tears but her expression determined. Then Elizabeth Hayes stood as well, despite her husband's attempt to pull her back down. One by one, other women in the courthouse began to rise, the baker's wife, the schoolteacher, the minister's widow, until nearly every woman in the room was standing. "I've learned," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "that my husband died trying to prevent exactly the kind of hatred and vengeance that I've been carrying in my heart. He died recognizing his killer as a man, not a monster, and if I let his death serve only revenge, then I dishonor everything he tried to do in his final moments." The silence in the courthouse was profound, broken only by the soft sound of weeping from both men and women who had been forced to confront the full complexity of their world. "Thomas believed in mercy," Sarah said, looking directly at Naalnish. "He believed in seeing the humanity in others, even when it was difficult. If there's to be any meaning to his death, any honor to his memory, it must be in choosing understanding over hatred, healing over revenge." She turned to address the entire courtroom, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had looked into the depths of loss and found something other than bitterness. "This Apache warrior didn't kill my husband out of evil. He killed him out of desperation, trying to feed his starving children. And Thomas, my Thomas, understood that in his final moments. The least I can do is try to understand it too." As Sarah Fletcher sat back down, the weight of her words settled over the courthouse like desert silence after a storm. Judge Morrison looked out at the sea of faces, some angry, some confused, but many touched by the widow's courage to choose grace over vengeance. "Court is dismissed," Morrison said quietly. "May God help us all find a better path forward." As the crowd began to file out into the afternoon sun, Naalnish was led toward the door, his chains finally being removed by a sheriff who seemed reluctant to meet his eyes. But as he passed the row where the widows sat, he stopped. "Your husband spoke my daughter's name before he died," Naalnish said quietly to Sarah Fletcher. "He remembered her from the reservation, remembered that she had learned to read from the mission school. His last thoughts were not of anger, but of the children, yours and mine, who must live with what we have done." Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Around them, the courthouse was emptying, but something had changed in the desert air. Not peace exactly, but the possibility of it, fragile as a flower blooming after rain. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of hope and sorrow intertwined. In Silver Creek, the trial was over, but the work of healing, for Apache and settler alike, was just beginning.